Good morning, everybody. So it's my pleasure to introduce Jeanne Lenzer. I've known Jeanne for a long time, and if you are thinking about understanding the ways in which the economic infrastructure in our society influences decisions in medicine, there's probably nobody who can articulate that better than Jeanne can. I've known her in a number of contexts. She works as a physician assistant for us in our access program upstate, but soon realized that that was only a side job and that her main role is as an investigative journalist. And if you've read any of her work, you would understand how intensely these things are researched and how much credibility she brings to this field. One of the things that she's very concerned about and has written a lot about is over-testing. And that's something I know that we're all very concerned about. In fact, I got an email from her just a couple of weeks ago saying how she was deeply concerned about over-testing that we were doing in our own environment, partially stimulated by some of the alerts that are being issued to providers when they're seeing patients. And so we'll be taking a look at that, and hopefully she can help us with some of that. But her most recent book, which she's here to talk about, is The Danger Within Us, America's Untested, Unregulated Medical Device Industry and One Man's Battle to Survive It. And you may have seen she had an op-ed published in the New York Times recently about the same subject, and also has had a number of radio interviews and others about this. She's written for the New York Times Magazine, Discover, the Smithsonian Magazine, The Atlantic, New Republic, Mother Jones, Washington Monthly, American Prospect, USA Today, Newsweek, and many, many others. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce, I guess I should say partially, our own superstar, Jeanne Lenzer. Thanks.
Thanks, Neil, and I feel very lucky to work with you and in this environment. So I'm here today to talk about cure as cause, and I'm going to discuss cure as cause, give several examples, and talk about the illusions that are created by cure as cause. And I'll discuss how and why these illusions arise and are often overlooked and sometimes exploited by industry to promote their drugs and medical devices. I want to start by telling the story of a mysterious, could I have the next slide? A mysterious epidemic of, oh, I'm sorry, it's right here.
Okay.
Thank you. Just there, thanks. So I want to start by telling the story of a mysterious epidemic of paralysis that broke out in the late 1950s and lasted until 1970. Keiko Yamaguchi was one victim of the outbreak. She was 21 when she developed diarrhea. A few weeks later, her toes went numb. Then numbness and weakness crept up her legs to her hips, and her vision began to fail. That was in early 1967. By the end of 1968, Yamaguchi, just 22 years old, was blind and paralyzed from the waist down. Ultimately, an estimated 11,000 people in Japan alone were afflicted, and additional cases were reported in Great Britain, Sweden, Mexico, India, Australia, and several other countries. The disease, dubbed subacute myelooptic neuropathy, or SMON, S-M-O-N, SMON, generally started with diarrhea and vomiting. And some patients, like Yamaguchi, became paralyzed and blind. Some developed a curious sign called green hairy tongue, when what looked like little tiny sprouts of green hairs grew out of their tongues. And some had green urine. The outbreaks occurred in clusters. Family members came down with the disease, as did doctors and nurses who treated the patients. Approximately 5 to 10% of victims died, and in Japan, an estimated 900 died. researchers launched vigorous efforts to determine the cause of the outbreak, which came on the heels of a massive polio outbreak in the United States during the 1950s, when doctors were scrambling to control the outbreak with the newly developed polio vaccine. It seemed likely that SMAN is a paralyzing disease that occurred in outbreaks like polio was probably due to a virus. And doctors thought an answer was at hand when a researcher announced that he'd isolated echovirus from SMAN patients. But soon other viruses were isolated from the patients, including Coxsackie and a herpes virus. So they isolated Coxsackie, herpes, but one by one, each claim was shot down when researchers were unable to reproduce the earlier laboratory findings. Other possible causes, including environmental, chemical causes, and drugs, were considered and similarly discarded. It wasn't until 1970 that the etiology of SMAN was discovered, and it turned out to be an antibiotic, cleoquinol. And the green hairy tongue and green urine were simply metabolites of the drug. 1 month after the discovery, Japan banned cleoquinol, and the SMAN epidemic, one of the largest drug disasters in history, was brought to a halt. So how did the epidemic take hold? And why was it far more prevalent in Japan than in other countries? Turns out that in Japan, cleoquinol was widely used both as a treatment and a prophylactic for stomach ailments. So when patients developed stomach problems, they would take cleoquinol. And since Japanese doctors could dispense drugs from their own pharmacies and pocket the profits, a practice considered to comprise a conflict of interest in many peer nations, patients were often prescribed the drug at higher doses and for longer periods than they were in other countries. And when the drug caused SMAN, doctors would often treat them with more cleoquinol, thinking that they simply hadn't corralled the problem in. And when they treated patients that presented with nausea and vomiting, doctors, nurses, and family members also took cleoquinol, thereby producing the very disease that they were trying to prevent. In other words, in this case, the cure was the cause. Examining the story with the benefit of the retrospectoscope, it's easy to see why this looked like an infectious outbreak. It did occur in clusters, healthcare workers came down with the disease, and yet we know something quite different now. Unfortunately, the lessons of SMAN and cure as cause aren't well known, in part due to natural illusions that can arise. I mean, it was pretty natural for people to make some of the assumptions they did in this circumstance. But it's also because big pharma and big device makers have become quite adept at concealing the problem of cure as cause and even exploiting the illusions that arise from it. And I'm going to give some examples. But I'll add that Ciba-Geigy, even back then, during the cleoquinol debacle, and they were the manufacturer, of course, of cleoquinol, they fought mightily against the discovery of the drug as the cause. And when a Swiss veterinarian published reports in 1965 that dogs given cleoquinol developed seizures and died, what did Ciba-Geigy do? They told veterinarians not to give it to animals. They didn't issue anything for people. So my own exposure to cure as cause came when I was working as an ERPA, and in accordance with the then current guidelines by the American Heart Association, I routinely gave lidocaine to patients with acute chest pain. And by giving the drug, it seemed to work beautifully. I mean, I could see those terrible PVCs that could trigger a terrible run of VFib. I could see them disappear and melt away, and it really felt good to save lives until I found out that I wasn't saving lives at all. In the early 1990s, more than a decade after the American Heart Association had recommended lidocaine for chest pain, a recommendation it has now withdrawn. Now you use it to treat dysrhythmias, not as a prophylactic. Studies with disturbing results began to emerge. In 1992, one author wrote in the Journal of Emergency Medicine that although the drug could reduce PVCs, quote, overall mortality may be increased. 2 years later, a study sponsored by the National Institutes of Health called the Cardiac Arrhythmia Suppression Trial, the CAS trial, which many of you are familiar with, found that drugs related to lidocaine, oral drugs such as flecainide and propafenone, could also suppress abnormal rhythms, but that if the abnormal beats did occur despite medication, they were more likely to trigger deadly rhythms, causing patients who were treated with the drugs to be 3.6 times as likely to die as patients given placebo. Thus, lidocaine and related drugs could fix the PVCs but kill more patients than they saved in the process. To put it in the vernacular, the operation was a success, but the patient died. This was the beginning of my lesson in Cure as Cause, and I left medicine to become a medical investigative journalist because I was both devastated and fascinated. I wanted to know how it could be possible that we were killing patients when we were eyewitnesses to so many cures. And if so, if we were really killing patients, why didn't we see the carnage that we were causing? How is it possible for patients and doctors alike to become involved in this massive folie à deux, a dance in which everyone was convinced that the march of medical progress was saving lives, even when it wasn't? And if we could be fooled by this class of drugs, I wanted to know how many other mirages were we chasing. Eventually, I learned that the problem was far from uncommon, and it shouldn't come as a surprise that Cure as Cause is a widespread problem, since every drug and device targets the very body systems and physiologic mechanisms that are already disordered. It's very easy to overshoot or perturb already disordered systems. In other words, the sweet spot that we seek can be a very tiny spot in a very large target that's often moving because of the body's own feedback loops and its attempts to maintain homeostasis, along with other environmental factors. Cleoquinol and antidysrhythmic drugs are just two of the many drugs and devices implicated in Cure as Cause. In some instances, the problem means certain drugs and devices are neither safe nor effective. In other instances, it simply means that they may be somewhat less safe and effective than previously thought, but still useful. In the US, where up to a third of medical interventions are estimated to comprise overtesting and overtreatment, it's clear that many patients stand to achieve no benefit from such overtreatment, but nonetheless expose them to all the harms. A problem I began to suspect contributes, at least to some degree, to our poor health outcomes when compared to peer nations. Of course, there are myriad other factors, but I suspect that the problem remains partially invisible due to the illusions that are created, much as they were created with SMAN. Other examples include artificial hips to treat degenerative hip disease that instead destroyed the hip from a problem called metallosis. And there are antibiotics to treat infections that cause infections by allowing overgrowth of C. diff, chemotherapeutic agents to treat cancer that cause cancer, combination biologic devices to treat spine instability and prevent paralysis that instead promoted bony overgrowth and caused paralysis and even death. Stents to prevent coronary occlusion that attract clots and cause occlusion, actually that was supposed to say inferior vena cava's filters, and cardiac defibrillators that can fire incorrectly, causing severe dysrhythmias and death. This isn't to say that just because a drug or device can overshoot it is useless. Even interventions associated with serious harms can nonetheless be beneficial when used in the right population. But we have to have honest numbers to understand when a drug and device is beneficial. In 2009, I was contacted by Dennis Fagan, a Texan, a former firefighter and paramedic, who said he was nearly killed by an implanted medical device. Until I looked into his story, I thought devices were great advances over drugs. I figured they were inert and would not cause side effects like drugs. I couldn't have been more wrong. Fagan's story led me to do a deep dive into the development, promotion, regulatory approval, and oversight of medical devices. So I'll tell you a bit about Dennis Fagan. Fagan had poorly controlled partial complex seizures, and in 2000, at age 42, he had a vagus nerve stimulator, or a VNS device, implanted to control his seizures, or at least that's what the manufacturer claimed it could do through some unknown mechanism. But 6 years after he was implanted, things went terribly wrong. One night at about 2 in the morning, he was awakened by a pain in his throat, and he knew that that pain meant he'd had a seizure. So he got up and he went to his calendar and he made a vertical mark on that date, because that's how he knew how many seizures he's had, and he could show it to his neurologist to help adjust his medications. When Fagan's parents found him the next morning, there were 12 marks on that date. And when they let themselves into his home, they saw him walk out of his bedroom looking dazed and immediately lose consciousness and fall. When he came to, he got up, sat down on a kitchen chair, and before his parents could reach him, he fell again, this time face first into the floor. This time, afraid of another seizure, Fagan wiggled himself across the floor, propped himself up against the wall. His legs were splayed in front of him, his jeans were wet with urine, and he looked half dead. His parents frantically dialed his neurologist and an ambulance. And by the time the ambulance got there, they'd watched him lose consciousness 8 times. The paramedics immediately gave Fagan diazepam to stop his seizures, but it had no effect. So they rushed him to the local hospital where Larry Johnson, the ER doctor, gave him more diazepam, but nothing was working. Johnson was alarmed when he saw Fagan had gone into asystole, and he thumped him on the chest, trying to bring him back to life. But within minutes of Fagan's heart restarting, it stopped again. And that's when Johnson noticed something truly bizarre. Fagan's heart was stopping at exactly 3-minute intervals. The ER doctor couldn't make any sense of this. He called down a cardiologist. The cardiologist saw the same thing and was equally just confused and surprised by this. How could this be? And it wasn't until Fagan's neurologist arrived and explained that Fagan not only had a VNS device, but that the device was set to fire at exactly 3-minute intervals. So the device, instead of stopping his seizures, was stopping his heart. Little surprise, since we know what the function of the vagus nerve is. It's only when so this is even more significant because for nearly a year prior to his near-death experience, Fagan had been experiencing what both he and his neurologist thought was simply a new type of seizure, drop seizures. And the neurologist only learned otherwise that day when he arrived in the ER and could see Fagan's EKG tracing and see that his heart stopped at precisely every time the VNS device fired. And it was only when he managed to turn off the device that these new seizures completely stopped. When Fagan learned that the device nearly killed him, it launched him on what is now an 11-year battle with Cyberonics, the manufacturer. Cyberonics is now, by the way, LivaNova. The FDA, state agencies, more neurologists, and indirectly the Supreme Court. As I reported on his story, I was sucked into something that really made me feel like I had been transported into a Kafka novel. But if Cura's cause was a natural illusion for those looking at Fagan's events on an individual level, there's another aspect to Cura's cause that's particularly troubling, and that's how industry not infrequently exploits these illusions. When the VNS device was approved by the FDA in 1997, the agency based its approval on a study by Cyberonics claiming that 1/3 of patients had a 50% reduction in seizures. However, there's another data point that wasn't highlighted by the company. Up to 1/3 of patients had more seizures, as much as 690% more seizures. So the question is, why was the company able to claim that the device was beneficial if about as many patients had more seizures as had fewer seizures? It turns out that everything hinges on something I call Minglish. And that is words that mean one thing in plain language or English and mean something entirely different in medicine. And a few of those words include significant, you're familiar with that problem, benefit, and even the word and. But in this case, the word that's relevant is the word benefit. And it needs to be deconstructed as it's used in medicine, which is entirely different from how it's used in plain language. In plain language, if someone says, a friend of yours says, I deposited my money in bank A and I benefited, we assume that they mean net benefit, that interest exceeded any bank fees. But that's not the case in medicine. Benefits are reported separately as multiple endpoints. So you can test 10 different endpoints on 10 different studies, report a single endpoint, and say, we won. And harms are reported separately. And we don't know what happened to those 9 other benefits. Did they fail? Did they get worse? And we often don't know about the harms until much later. And this separate reporting is actually for an understandable reason, in part because it's not like money. We can't just add it up and subtract it. If we reduce heart attacks in patients from drugs to treat hypertension, but those drugs cause liver failure, there's no single metric that we can use to add that up. So we have to report these things separately. So to return to the VNS and how this works and how industry can exploit this, it was categorized as a benefit of the VNS if the endpoint of benefit was patients who achieved a 50% reduction in seizures. That's the benefit endpoint. But if they had more seizures, well, that wasn't part of benefit. So you simply tucked that away in small print lower down. You didn't subtract that there were nearly 1/3 of people who had more seizures and about 1/3 of people who had fewer, and say, no real net effect. That would not have done well for Cyberonics' bottom line. So instead, they simply relied on the idea that you might get a benefit from this device. Of course, in their promotional materials, the company wasn't even that precise. Here's what Cyberonics says on its current web page in large font. VNS device, fewer seizures, shorter seizures, faster recovery. Why wait? And if you were a seizure patient, wouldn't that sound good enough? Even doctors who prescribe the device, I've found, are generally unaware of the small print, including the study that found that when patients' batteries depleted and the device didn't work anymore, they had a dramatic reduction in seizures. So just as cure as cause is used to exploit presumed benefits of intervention, it's also used to minimize harms. And here's how I came to learn about this problem. While I was attending an FDA hearing, a corporate insider sidled up to me and asked if I'd like to see some secret internal corporate documents that showed that a company was concealing known harms of their blockbuster drug. Now, I'm an investigative journalist. To come up and ask me that. Anyway, my source ultimately sent me the secret internal documents from Eli Lilly, citing their own internal study and analysis that found a doubling of suicidality among patients given Prozac versus those given placebo. Yet during FDA hearings at the same time, the company insisted that suicides were not caused by the drug, but instead were only caused by underlying depression. Of course, not all patients on Prozac got worse. Some appeared to obtain genuine benefit, but it's important to know whether a drug or device may actually mimic the symptoms of an underlying condition, as it has very practical implications for management. Joe Glenmullen, a Harvard psychiatrist, says that before he realized the problem of cure as cause with antidepressants, when a patient of his worsened on Prozac or another antidepressant, he'd up the dose, thinking he hadn't given them enough medicine. And he describes some hair-raising outcomes of that approach. But it was only when he began to realize that some patients worsen dramatically and become more suicidal on these drugs that he began to forewarn his patients, look, some people get benefit from this, Some people get worse. And if you get worse, don't assume it's you. It may be the drug. I want you to call me immediately. And he said his outcomes since then have been much, much better. Once again, as with the VNS device and antidysrhythmic drugs, good outcomes are ascribed to the drug or device, while bad outcomes are ascribed to the underlying disease. And this is a repeated mistake in medicine. Clearly, numbers matter, but here's where the plot thickens. I later reported on Tracy Johnson, a young woman found hanging dead in Eli Lilly Laboratories in Indianapolis. She was enrolled in a study of the antidepressant duloxetine, or Cymbalta. But the company wasn't studying the drug to treat depression. They were studying it to treat stress urinary incontinence. And they wanted healthy volunteers, which is what Tracy Johnson was, a healthy volunteer. And in fact, Lilly, knowing that there was a problem with this issue of suicides in their drugs, certainly didn't want people committing suicide when they were simply healthy volunteers. So they were very careful to screen all the participants in this study for depression, and they made sure that patients were excluded if they had any signs of depression. And yet, Tracy was found hanging dead, apparently by suicide in Eli Lilly Laboratories. And when I reported on her, I asked for the FDA's printout of all deaths related to the drug. And I got their Excel database, and I was able to track her death and the deaths of 5 other people in these studies that were not in the FDA's database. And yet I had requested all unpublished data from the FDA. I was dumbfounded when this happened, and I wanted to understand why these deaths were not in the database. And what I found led me to the existence of trade secret deaths. Those are deaths that companies and the FDA conceal, not only from the public, but even from researchers seeking unpublished data. And it's all legal. And here's how it works. If a company tests a drug for an indication and doesn't win FDA approval for that indication, the data are considered confidential commercial information, known in the industry as CCI. Of course, when something fails an indication, the question is, was it simply ineffective for that indication, or did it cause harms that were not previously detected? And this is critically important when a drug is already on the market and being used by patients. As was the case with duloxetine. They were testing it for stress urinary incontinence, but the FDA didn't approve it for that in the United States. But it was already on the market for depression and in widespread use. So it would seem that this would be important information for those patients. But the company continued to insist. Now, mind you, when I'm reporting on this, the study had not been published. And in fact, when I contacted the FDA, they said they would neither confirm nor deny that there was such a study in existence. And the company continued to insist that it was underlying depression, not the drug, that would cause suicidality. Yet there could be no more important and determinative study to sort this out than a study in which non-depressed patients given duloxetine, as was the case for Tracy, were explicitly screened and excluded for depression, and yet patients started jumping off tall buildings and hanging themselves. It would give lie to the idea that antidepressants don't increase suicidality. Later, the company did publish a study, and it did show that women enrolled in the study for stress urinary incontinence were twice as likely as women not given duloxetine to commit suicide, or to be suicidal, or to commit suicide. I subsequently spoke with Eric Turner, a psychiatrist who had requested all unpublished data from the FDA regarding antidepressants, and he published his findings in the New England Journal of Medicine, and you may be familiar with that. When he looked at published versus unpublished findings, it turns out, of course, what you all already can intuit, that published findings were virtually all studied, can I say it? Positive studies were virtually all reported. Negative studies were virtually left unreported. And they basically canceled themselves out. So I asked him if he knew about these trade secret deaths and that he had been denied these data, as I had been, and he was shocked. So now I'll return to the VNS and its harms and its role in cure's cause. And it turns out that Dennis Fagan was luckier than he knew, for he survived. However, during an FDA advisory panel meeting to decide whether to approve the device, there was so much concern expressed about a high rate of deaths among test subjects that they decided to approve the device only conditionally, meaning that they'd let the company put it on the market and they'd have to prove it was safe after it was on the market. Of course, they didn't tell the company you have to tell patients this, so of course they were not told this. Can you imagine if a patient was told, gee whiz, we've got this new device, it might help you, it might reduce your seizures maybe by half, but it killed a bunch of people, we're not sure if it's really safe, would you like to have it? No, maybe some patients would be desperate enough, and that's fine if you do it with truly informed consent. But the company didn't tell patients that it had been approved only conditionally because of a high rate of deaths, nor did the FDA require that, nor does it require that of any of the companies that get conditional approval, which is not an uncommon occurrence. How much time do I have? What time is it?
It's 8:34 right now.
Thank you. So I will mention this. 12 years after the device was on the market, this conditional approval, meaning they were supposed to prove it was safe, I went to the FDA. First, I went to the company and I said, where are your studies proving it's safe? And they sent me 5 studies. And I read each of the 5 studies very carefully, and there was one interesting thing missing. There was no report on whether there were any deaths or not. So I went to the FDA thinking, oh, unpublished data, I'm going to get them now. It must be that it was a bad outcome. That's why they didn't report it. And I said to the FDA, where's the safety data? And they sent me the exact same 5 studies. And I thought, did you guys even read these studies? So I went back to the company and I said, I'd like your unpublished data on the deaths from these studies. And they said, we never collected mortality data. I couldn't believe it. I was dumbfounded. I thought for sure the FDA would have to shut them down now. Here was a device approved conditionally because of a concern about deaths. The company doesn't collect death data, and yet they claim it's safe. And I said, how can you say it's safe? And the company told me, oh, well, we did collect death data. We got it from the Social Security Index, separately from the 5 studies. They collected Social Security death data. And I was writing for the BMJ, formerly the British Medical Journal at the time, and I said, well, will you release it to us, to the BMJ? And they said, no. So I went back to the FDA and said, you have no death data. How can you say this is safe? And the FDA's answer? We didn't ask them to count deaths. We only asked them to characterize deaths. I'll get to how they characterize deaths. Fagan discovered that after his experience, there were nearly 800 people in the FDA's MAUDE database, which is the database that collects device adverse events. And he found that about 800 people had died, and at this time, only 50,000 people had been implanted, and this was not long after it had been released on the market. And the average age of implantees during testing was 33 years old. This is very concerning. And then, in reading the descriptions of the cases, many of them were shockingly similar to what happened to Fagan. There were patients who had episodes of severe bradycardia and asystole, who developed, quote, drop seizures, and patients who mysteriously died suddenly, like the patient who was described as he walked in a room and dropped over dead. That was the limit of most death reports. Patient found dead in a bathtub. Patient walked in room, dropped dead. There was no other information, and yet in virtually every circumstance, the identical language was issued by Cyberonics about the cause of death. And what they said is, and I will quote, there is no evidence at this time that the VNS caused or contributed to the reported event. Now here we have Fagan, who, as you know, developed asystole every time the device fired. They turn off the device, the episodes stop. And what was Cyberonic's conclusion in his case? There is no evidence at this time that the device caused or contributed to the event. As Fagan said, if he'd been found dead, the company and probably his own doctors would have said he died of SUDEP, or sudden unexpected death of epilepsy, because patients with epilepsy do die. And the concern in the FDA advisory hearing was that they were dying at a higher rate than might be expected even with SUDEP. And Fagan's right. Had he been found dead that morning, there would have been no EKG tracing to tell the true story of what was going on, nor would there be an EKG tracing of what happened when they turned the device off. So before we go to questions, I want to share a few resources for those of you interested in non-industry sources of information. As you can tell, I'm biased towards industry-independent sources. And by the way, we do have a list. Shannon Brownlee, who's the author of Overtreated, she and I put together a list, and it was published in the BMJ, of industry-independent experts. I think there's someone in this room who's on that list. May even be more than one person, I'm not sure. And it's Neil Kalman. And we also have some non-industry sources. So let me put my very favorite journal title: Why Olanzapine Beats Risperidone, Risperidone Beats Quetiapine, and Quetiapine Beats Olanzapine. 33. Now, why does this happen? Because 33 of 42 reports were manufacturer-sponsored, and this causes what my pal Shannon Brownlee calls, what is that? What's the Garrison Keillor thing about the people who, all men are beautiful, all women are strong, and all drugs are better than all other drugs. And this is why. So here are here are just a few. I have a much longer list, both on my website and in the book, but these are some independent centers. The Harding Center does brilliant patient presentations, visual ones, that you can use to explain screening harms and benefits to patients in a more realistic way. Lown Institute, Right Care Alliance, if you're interested in making change and also reading their critiques. I should say that Health News Review, which I didn't put on here because it's a journalism outlet, is brilliant, and it does a lot of great analyses of studies coming out. I don't know, I have National Physicians Alliance. Oh, they're doing stuff on costs right now. They have a campaign about costs of drugs. The NNT does some great stuff, as does Therapeutics Initiative. And the latest one, newest great addition, is TransPerimed. Amazing stuff. Written copies of this talk are available. Some of the things I said might sound unbelievable, so I want you to know everything is citationed. It's all published, and the accusations I have made have all been published, and none of them have had to be retracted. So if you want a copy of this talk and its citations, just ping me an email, and I will email back to you. So, questions?
Thanks, Jeannie. So things that people have different manifestations of disease, and things that we think of as one disease, now we know as many diseases, right? And so one of the explanations for why some people get better and some people get worse is that those people are different to begin with. So how do we differentiate that from the stuff that you're talking about? And then a second question is about the post-surveillance stuff, and what are companies really supposed to do when they have products that some people get better and some people get worse? That happens a lot with cancer chemotherapy. And now we know that, as you do more and more genetic testing, you find out, well, all prostate cancers aren't the same, and some are going to get better and some are going to get worse using the same drugs, some cancers. So how do we differentiate that from the device and drug effect?
So obviously I can't answer that huge question, but I do have some thoughts because I've discussed that very issue with Shannon and others quite a bit. And the one thing that concerns me is when you don't know if the outcome is going to be a death that you can't prevent, knowing the total overall numbers for a group is important. So, for example, with prostate cancer screening, in my New York Times article, what I did is I likened it, actually, our disgraced David Newman described it as walking into a room and you have a choice. Do you want to go into the room on this side or the room on this side? The room on this side where you get screened, you find out that you may have cancer, and a doctor pulls out a gun and shoots you in the groin because so many men are going to become impotent, they're going to become incontinent, and they're going to die of treatment. Versus you go into the other room and you may die of the prostate cancer because you're not screened. And it's a longer, slower effect, but once you develop the disease, as Otis Brawley, the chief scientific and medical officer of the American Cancer Society says, we can treat it once you have symptoms. If you have symptoms, there are things we can do, but he's not a believer in prostate. I don't know if all of you know this, but the American Cancer Society did not recommend prostate cancer screening. This came from Otis Brawley's work. Otis Brawley himself, who's African American, chooses not to be screened himself. So you have, if you don't know whether you're going to die or not of the condition, what I'm trying to get to is that if it's death and you just don't know, you want to know your total overall numbers. That's what you want to, I mean, for me, that's what I'd want to know. Well, what are my chances? And what we know from the all-cause mortality studies of both PLCO and Urspic, those two massive studies, where it's claimed that one showed it saved lives and the other claimed it didn't. Neither study showed that it saved lives. Both showed that when it came to overall mortality, there was no difference. And the numbers were so massive that if there is any difference, it was a very tiny difference, meaning that the confidence intervals were narrow, and there could be a very slight benefit, there could also be a very slight harm. So I personally would want to know what's my overall chance. Now, on the individual level, some people get better, some people have different disease. Well, if it's not death, that's what Joe Glenn Mullen is doing with antidepressants. He's saying, yeah, the numbers, weren't great for antidepressant trials, but I still believe some of my patients get better. That's his approach. And so he says, let's try it on you. If you get better, good. And if you seem to be veering off the track, let's take you off it and try something else. So that's my response to that. Any other questions, queries? God, I hate that light.
Thanks, Jeannie. So one question is, there's this information that you provide about the uncertainty or the deliberate distortion of data, and yet we don't change the way we practice medicine. So, one of the questions as somebody who's sort of delved into this and spoken to certain people is, are there things, and as you know, we're involved in a lot of education. And, are there things that we could do in how we present information? We think we do this critically, and we think that we're objective, but your stories clearly highlight the fact that it's very hard to change behavior. So do you have any suggestions about, again, this might be too big of a topic, but, there's all this, quote, evidence to challenge evidence,
Yeah.
and yet we continue to sort of foster bad habits.
John Abramson, a Harvard doctor who wrote Overdose, told me that when he started to realize how bad the evidence is and how distorted, he said he felt paralyzed. He didn't know what he could prescribe, what he could do. And I too, the other day somebody asked me something and I said, well, it appears that this is a really good option. And I said, but I don't know. I'm repeating what, we know, and that's the best we can do. So I try to be honest with patients and tell them, there's a lot of uncertainty, but I also use the Harding graphics is very helpful, and just say, this is what it appears to be at this time. And some patients are aggressive. They want to take risks for what they do. And I feel fine helping them do that if that's what they want. What I hate is getting patients involved in things and things go terribly wrong. And that's not what they wanted. They were never aware that those were the possibilities. So I try to be real upfront about what can happen.
What do you think is the role of direct-to-consumer marketing by pharmaceutical companies in all of this?
God, it ought to be outlawed. What do you think?
Well, is that like the first place to target? Because not only do we have crummy data, but we're asking lay people who have no experience in interpreting data to,
Yeah. Well, there was a
receive this
study
information?
done by Mike Wilkes and others that found that, yeah, not only does direct-to-consumer advertising affect the patients, it affects the doctors. So they come in and they get what they ask for. It's a serious problem, yeah. We need independent research, and we need to be taxed and pay the NIH for independent research. And the NIH is not doing independent research. They're partnering with industry like crazy. The CDC, let me tell you another quick story. Do I have time? What time is it? Okay, so the CDC's Tamiflu campaign. May I speak? Okay, anybody wants to pull out their guns now, go ahead, because I can't see with that light in my eyes. But the Tom Frieden, the CDC director, had this whole campaign where he told everybody, go to the ER right away, run to your doctors at the first sign of the flu or flu-like illness, because you can get an antiviral, oseltamivir, Tamiflu, and it's life-saving. That's what he said, it saves lives. So I called him up and said, asked for an interview, and I said, where'd you get this data? The FDA specifically told Roche, the manufacturer, that they may not claim that the drug saves lives or that it even stops pneumonia because they never provided evidence that showed that. So I asked Tom Frieden, how'd you come up with this? And he sent me their little analysis, and I read the analysis. And it was very interesting. Their analysis of all the literature specifically excluded the Cochrane analysis. Cochrane, of course, as you know, is the nice independent body that also determined that oseltamivir, you swap one set of symptoms for another for the last 12 hours of your disease. Instead of having snot and coffee and vomiting and diarrhea. And you jam up ERs and you jam up doctors' offices so that death rates from trauma and heart attacks goes up because it's almost impossible to deal with all of this. So at any rate, I asked him why he excluded the Cochrane analysis. And here's his answer, and this is so dumbfounding. This is why I say my article, I don't have this in here, but you can find this article. It's been published, and it's not been retracted, no corrections. He said, his answer, why they excluded the Cochrane analysis, and I quote him, because it only included RCTs. And I said, so how did you decide that it saves lives? And he said, well, we think that it's important to include case studies and observational data. Now, let me tell you who paid for this campaign. The CDC's campaign. Nobody knows this. The CDC does this massive campaign, go get oseltamivir. Who paid for it? The manufacturer. CDC is contaminated by industry money. The FDA is contaminated by industry money. The NIH is. We need to take our public institutions back. Can we have a riot now?
This is from Alan Remdy, who's on the faculty at the downtown program. Could you comment on the use of antipsychotics in general and for the non-FDA approved indications for insomnia and depression in children as well?
Playing with fire, that's all I can say. So I don't need to say any more. Just playing with fire. Yeah.
This is kind of a broad question, but have you seen changes in how medical journals deal with corporate-sponsored studies, or what their role is to play in publication bias, or what is your take on that?
It's a serious problem, and I write about it in the book, especially. I give some examples with orthopedic implants and journal editors who were getting tens of millions of dollars. And they were deep-sixing negative studies and putting in positive studies. The New England Journal, it seems that medical journals have sort of gone the direction that our country has right now. The New England Journal has definitely taken the pro-industry course, and their stuff is just, it's not good. The BMJ, and of course I'm biased. I've written for them for many years, but part of the reason I write for them is because they are willing to publish things that get them in trouble. And in fact, Eli Lilly spent $1 million fighting one of my articles in the BMJ, and I asked my editor why they were willing to publish my stuff. And she said, because we don't get that much money from drug companies. You know, she was pretty upfront. Most of their money at the time came from ads for doctors' employment. And they are supported by the BMA.
So of all those sources that you have up there, so what's the best place for folks to look, you know, if you were trying to counsel your patient about the different kinds of knee implants or the different kinds of, you know, pacemakers and things like that that are available? What source as patient advocates is there for us to look at?
There's no easy answer to that. It's very difficult. I can't tell you the numbers of people who've come to me asking questions about specific implants. And as much research as I did on a bunch of different implants, I mean, I'm just awed at the tens of thousands of implants there are, and it's very hard to keep up with it. Now, actually, a doctor I work with came to me the other day about an implant he was concerned about. He said, oh, the doctors told him that, you know, no worry, there were virtually no deaths associated with it. I said, really, you know, Phil, I don't know that we can find anything. I said, but we went to the MAUD database, and immediately there were tons of deaths listed there. So you can go to the MAUD database. It's not science, you know, it's just people saying, you know, there was a death, there was a complete liver failure, whatever, associated with this patient who has this device. Is it a causal relationship? You know, we don't have denominators, we don't have numerators in that database, but it actually can start to give you some information, because if they've had the implant for 1 week and they die, and there's an awful lot of those happening, your ears might perk up. And in fact, that's precisely what happened when we opened up for him.
Are you aware of these large studies that have been coming out of a Denmark database about birth control and depression and birth control and breast cancer?
No, I'm not.
Oh, okay.
I know nothing about it.
Yeah, they're very disturbing. Okay, never mind.
Thank you.